My name is Marcus Davis, and I'm about to tell you something that will shake you to your core. Picture this. You're standing in the middle of your hometown's VFW hall, surrounded by neighbors who've watched you grow up, veterans who've served alongside your late father, and family members you've loved your entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The American flag hangs proudly behind a makeshift podium, and everyone's gathered because they think they're here to celebrate your promotion from major to lieutenant colonel. Your chest swells with pride, not just for yourself, but for the family name you've carried with honor for 15 years of military service. Then your own brother steps forward, his face twisted with something you've never seen before. He raises his voice so everyone in that packed hall can hear, and he says the words that will haunt you forever. Don't celebrate him. Marcus doesn't deserve this promotion. He failed when it mattered most, and I have proof. The silence that follows is deafening. You can hear your mother's sharp intake of breath, see your younger sister's eyes go wide with shock, feel the weight of every stare in that room. In that moment, everything you've built, everything you've sacrificed for, everything you are, crumbles to dust. But here's what my brother Ryan didn't know. Here's what none of them knew. I had been carrying a secret for 3 months. Something so explosive, so life-changing, that when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just vindicate me. It would expose a web of lies that had been poisoning our family for years. The town of Cedar Falls, Ohio, has a population of exactly 8,247 people, and on any given day, it feels like every single one of them knows your business. It's the kind of place where your third-grade teacher still asks about your mother at the grocery store, where the mailman knows when you're having marital problems before your spouse does, and where your family's reputation can make or break your entire existence. Our family, the Davis family, had built that reputation over 3 generations, brick by brick, handshake by handshake, promise by promise. My grandfather, William Davis, started Davis Family Hardware in 1952, with nothing but a GI Bill, a dream, and calloused hands that knew the value of honest work. By the time my father, Robert Davis, took over in the 80s, our store wasn't just a business. It was the heartbeat of Main Street, the place where farmers came for their morning coffee and gossip, where young couples bought their first tools for their first homes, where 3 generations of families had trusted us with their projects, their problems, and their lives. Dad was everything a small town could want in a man, 6'2", with hands like anvils and a smile that could disarm the angriest customer. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and never once talked about the war unless someone specifically asked. Even then, his stories were always about the guys he served with, never about himself. He taught Sunday school at Cedar Falls Methodist, coached Little League for 23 years, and somehow managed to know every person in town by their first name and their favorite brand of screws. But more than anything, Dad was a father who believed in his children. He had 3 of us: Ryan, born in 1978, me in 1980, and Emma in 1985. Ryan was the golden child from day one, the one who could fix anything with his hands, who understood the business intuitively, who seemed destined to carry on the family legacy. I was the dreamer, the one who read military history books under my covers with a flashlight, who built model airplanes and talked endlessly about serving my country. Emma was the peacemaker, the one who could smooth over any argument, who somehow managed to love all of us equally, even when we made it nearly impossible. Growing up, Ryan and I weren't rivals, we were partners. He taught me how to throw a curveball, how to change a car's oil, how to talk to girls without stammering like an idiot. I helped him with his homework, covered for him when he snuck out to meet Sarah Chen behind the movie theater, and listened to his dreams about expanding the family business into the next county. We were the Davis boys, and Cedar Falls watched us grow up with the kind of fond attention that small towns reserve for their own. The first crack in our foundation appeared when I was 17. It was a hot August evening, and Dad had closed the store early so we could all attend the annual Veterans Day planning meeting at the VFW hall. Ryan was 19, already working full-time at the store and talking about community college business classes. Emma was 12, sitting between Mom and Dad, drawing horses in her notebook like she always did during boring adult meetings. That's when Sergeant First Class Jennifer Torres walked into our lives. She was a recruiter, stationed out of Columbus, and she'd come to Cedar Falls specifically to talk about opportunities for young people who wanted to serve their country. She was maybe 35, with the kind of bearing that commanded respect, and eyes that seemed to see right through you. When she started talking about leadership, about honor, about the chance to make a difference beyond the borders of our small town, something inside me caught fire. After the meeting, I approached her with shaking hands and a voice that cracked like I was 13 again. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about the Army since I was little. My dad served, and I know it would mean a lot to him if I followed in his footsteps." Sergeant Torres studied me for a long moment, and then she smiled. "Tell me about yourself, son. What makes you think you've got what it takes?" For the next hour, I told her everything. About my grades, my leadership positions at school, my dreams of becoming an officer, my desire to honor my father's legacy while forging my own path. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her expression growing more interested with each word. When I finished, she handed me a business card. "Marcus Davis, I think you might be exactly what the Army is looking for. But this isn't a decision you make lightly, and it's not one you make alone. Talk to your family. Think about what you're really committing to. If you're serious, call me in 2 weeks." I walked home that night, feeling like I was floating 3 feet off the ground. This was it. This was my chance to become something more than the second son in a family hardware store. This was my opportunity to serve, to lead, to make Dad proud in a way that felt uniquely mine. But when I told my family at dinner the next night, the reaction wasn't what I'd hoped for. Ryan's fork clattered against his plate. "You want to leave? Just like that? You want to abandon everything Dad's built? Everything our family stands for?" "I'm not abandoning anything," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm serving my country. Dad did the same thing." "Dad served and then came home to build something lasting," Ryan shot back. "He didn't run away to play soldier when his family needed him." "Boys," Dad said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "That's enough." Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Patricia Davis was the kind of woman who could manage a household, help run a business, and still find time to bake cookies for every school fundraiser. Her touch was warm, but I could feel the tremor in her fingers. "Honey, are you sure this is what you want? You've got a good life here. You've got a future with the store." "The store is Ryan's future," I said, looking directly at my older brother. "It always has been. He's the one who loves it, who understands it, who wants to grow it. I want to serve." Dad was quiet for a long time, his eyes distant. Finally, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pride and worry, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Son, I served because my country called, and I came home because my family needed me. If this is truly what you feel called to do, then you have my blessing. But you better understand what you're choosing. The Army will change you. War will change you. And once you walk that path, there's no going back to the boy you were." Emma, who had been silent through the entire exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Will you come home? I mean, for visits and holidays and stuff?" I reached over and ruffled her hair. "Of course, Em. I'll come home every chance I get. And when I do, I'll have stories that'll make your head spin." Ryan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Fine. Go play hero. But don't expect me to pretend I understand it." He walked out of the dining room, and I heard his bedroom door slam a few minutes later. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But every time doubt crept in, I thought about Sergeant Torres, about the opportunities she described, about the chance to become the kind of leader my father had been in Vietnam. I thought about serving something bigger than myself, about earning the right to wear the uniform that had shaped the man I most admired. 2 weeks later, I called Sergeant Torres. 6 months after that, I shipped out to Fort Benning for basic training, carrying with me my father's dog tags and a promise that I would make the Davis name mean something in the Army just like it meant something in Cedar Falls. Ryan didn't speak to me for the 3 weeks leading up to my departure. He worked in the store, ate dinner with the family, went through all the motions of normal life, but he acted like I had already disappeared. The morning I left, he He was conspicuously absent, having left early for a, quote, supply run that everyone knew was just an excuse to avoid saying goodbye. Mom cried. Emma clung to my leg like she used to when she was little, and Dad shook my hand with the firm grip of a man who understood exactly what I was walking into. Make us proud, son, he said simply, but more importantly, come home whole. I promised him I would do both. For the first 5 years of my military career, that promise seemed easy to keep. I excelled in basic training, graduated near the top of my officer candidate school class, and earned my commission as a second lieutenant with honors. My first assignment was Fort Carson in Colorado, where I led a platoon of soldiers who were barely younger than me, but looked to me for guidance, direction, and leadership that I had to learn how to provide on the fly. The Army was everything I dreamed it would be, and nothing like I'd expected. It was harder than the most difficult day I'd ever spent in the hardware store, but it was also more rewarding than anything I'd ever experienced. I learned to make decisions under pressure, to carry responsibility for people's lives, to find strength I didn't know I possessed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I learned that leadership wasn't about being the smartest person in the room, or the toughest or the loudest. It was about earning trust, making hard choices, and putting your people's welfare above your own comfort. Every few months, I'd call home. The conversations with Mom and Emma were always warm, full of questions about my life and updates about their own. Dad's calls were different. He'd ask specific questions about my duties, my soldiers, my challenges. He understood in a way that the rest of the family couldn't, and his advice was always practical, always grounded in his own experience of leadership under fire. Ryan's relationship with me remained complicated. Sometimes he'd be on the phone, and we'd talk like nothing had changed. He'd tell me about improvements he was making to the store, about his plans to expand into landscaping supplies, about his relationship with Katie Morrison, his high school sweetheart who everyone expected him to marry eventually. Other times, there was an edge to his voice, a resentment that simmered just below the surface. Must be nice, he said during one particularly tense conversation, getting to see the world while some of us stay home and take care of responsibilities. Ryan, you love that store, I replied, trying to keep my voice level. You've always loved it. I thought you'd be happy to have it all to yourself. It's not about the store, Marcus. It's about choice. You gotta choose your path. I got stuck with the one you didn't want. I wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that he'd chosen his path just like I'd chosen mine, but I could hear the pain underneath his anger. Ryan had always been the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who stayed close to home and did what was expected. Maybe he'd never really considered that there might be other options until I'd taken one. My first deployment to Afghanistan in 2003 changed everything. Not just for me, but for how my family understood what I'd chosen to do with my life. The phone calls became less frequent, the emails more precious. When I did manage to get through to Cedar Falls, I could hear the worry in Mom's voice, the way she'd pause before asking how I was doing, as if she was afraid of the answer. But it was Dad who surprised me most. 3 months into my deployment, I received a package that contained not just the usual cookies and magazines, but a letter written in his careful handwriting. Son, it began, I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation before you deployed, and there are things I should have told you about what it means to lead soldiers in combat. The Army will teach you tactics and strategy, but they can't teach you how to live with the decisions you'll have to make. They can't prepare you for the weight of sending good people into danger, or the guilt you'll feel when not everyone comes home. What I'm telling you now is what I wish someone had told me before my first firefight in Vietnam. Your job isn't to be fearless. Your job is to be worthy of the trust your soldiers place in you. Everything else is just details. I carried that letter with me for the entire deployment, reading it whenever the weight of command felt too heavy to bear. And there were times when it felt impossibly heavy. Times when I had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers under my command. Times when those decisions turned out to be wrong, and I had to live with the consequences. But there were also moments of incredible pride. Watching young soldiers grow into leaders themselves, successfully completing missions that brought my entire platoon home safely, earning the respect of seasoned NCOs who had initially been skeptical of the young officer from small-town Ohio. When I returned from Afghanistan in 2004, I came home a different person. Not broken, but changed in ways that were hard to explain to people who hadn't experienced combat. I was promoted to first lieutenant, then captain, then major, as the years passed and my responsibilities grew. Each promotion felt like validation, proof that I'd chosen the right path, evidence that the sacrifices had been worth it. Ryan and I slowly began to rebuild our relationship during those years. He married Katie in 2006, and I managed to get leave to serve as his best man. Standing beside him at the altar of Cedar Falls Methodist, the same church where we'd been baptized and confirmed, I felt like we were finally becoming brothers again instead of strangers who shared a last name. Emma grew up while I was serving, transforming from the little girl who drew horses into a confident young woman studying education at Ohio State. She wrote me letters throughout college, telling me about her classes, her boyfriend Derek, her plans to become a teacher like Mrs. Henderson, who had inspired her in 4th grade. And Dad aged in the way that veterans do, quietly carrying the weight of his own service, while watching his son navigate the same challenges he'd faced decades earlier. We talked more openly about the realities of military life during my visits home, conversations that brought us closer together while helping me understand the man he'd always been beneath the gentle exterior. But it was during my second deployment to Iraq in 2008 that everything began to change in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The incident that would eventually tear my family apart happened on a scorching hot Tuesday in July, in a marketplace in Ramadi that should have been safe but wasn't. I was leading a convoy through what our intelligence indicated was a secure area when the world exploded around us. The IED blast took out the lead vehicle, killing Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez instantly, and wounding 3 other soldiers. What happened next would haunt me for years, and eventually become the ammunition my brother would use to try to destroy me. In the chaos that followed the explosion, with small arms fire erupting from multiple directions and my soldiers looking to me for orders that could save their lives or get them killed, I made a decision that felt right in the moment, but would be questioned, analyzed, and ultimately misrepresented for years to come. I ordered my remaining vehicles to establish a defensive perimeter while I led a small team on foot to retrieve Rodriguez's body and evacuate the wounded. It was a dangerous call, one that exposed my soldiers to additional risk, but it was also the right call. We never leave anyone behind. That's not just a motto in the Army. It's a sacred oath that defines who we are as soldiers and as human beings. We completed the mission successfully. We brought Rodriguez home, evacuated the wounded, and neutralized the threat with no additional casualties. The after-action report praised my leadership under fire and recommended me for a Bronze Star. But war is complicated, and sometimes successful missions have consequences that don't become apparent until much later. One of those consequences was sitting in a classified file 3,000 miles away, a file that contained information so sensitive, so potentially damaging to ongoing operations, that it would be sealed for years. Information that would eventually prove that my split-second decision in that marketplace had prevented a much larger catastrophe, saving not just my soldiers' lives but the lives of dozens of Iraqi civilians who would have been caught in a secondary attack. But I wouldn't learn about that classified information for 3 more years. All I knew at the time was that I'd done my job, brought my people home, and honored the trust they'd placed in me. When I returned from Iraq in 2009, something had shifted at home. Ryan seemed different, more distant, more resentful. The family business was thriving. Under his leadership, he and Katie had welcomed their first child, and by all external measures, his life was everything he'd ever wanted. But there was an edge to him now, a bitterness that came out in small comments and sideways glances. "Must be nice being the war hero," he'd say when I visited, the words delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad can't stop talking about your Bronze Star." "Ryan, this isn't a competition," I'd reply, but I could see that, for him it was. Somehow, my success in the military had become a reflection of his perceived failure to measure up, despite the fact that he was building something remarkable in his own right. Dad noticed the tension but seemed powerless to address it. He'd always been the patriarch who could solve any family problem with wisdom and patience. But this was different. This was about his sons choosing different paths, and struggling to understand each other's worth. It was Emma who finally put her finger on what was really happening during Christmas dinner in 2010. She was home from her first year of teaching, full of stories about her students and energy about making a difference in young people's lives. After Ryan made another cutting comment about military privilege, she slammed her fork down and stared at both of us. "You know what your problem is?" she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spent her days managing unruly teenagers. "You're both so busy comparing your achievements that you've forgotten you're supposed to be brothers. Ryan, you've turned Dad's store into something he never could have imagined. Marcus, you've served your country with honor. You're both successful, you're both good men, and you're both acting like idiots." The table fell silent. Mom looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Dad stared at Emma with something that might have been pride. And Ryan and I looked at each other across the table, seeing clearly for the first time in years how petty our rivalry had become. "She's right," I said finally. "I'm sorry, Ryan. I never meant for my choices to diminish what you've accomplished." Ryan was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm sorry too. I guess I've been feeling like everyone thinks I took the easy path by staying home." "There's nothing easy about what you've done," Dad said firmly. "Building a business, supporting a family, being part of this community, that takes its own kind of courage." We thought we'd turned a corner that Christmas. We thought we'd found our way back to being the Davis boys who'd grown up together, who'd always had each other's backs. We had no idea that the worst was yet to come, and that the very success I'd earned through 15 years of faithful service would soon become the weapon my brother would use to try to destroy everything I'd built. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Thursday morning in March 2012. I was at Fort Leavenworth, deep into the Command and General Staff College program that would prepare me for senior leadership positions, when my cell phone rang with Mom's number on the display. The tremor in her voice told me something was terribly wrong before she even spoke the words. "Marcus, honey, you need to come home. Your father's had a heart attack." The next 18 hours passed in a blur of emergency flights, rental cars, and sterile hospital corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair. By the time I reached Cedar Falls Regional Medical Center, Dad was stable but weak, his face gray against the white hospital pillows. The doctors spoke in careful, measured tones about damage to his heart muscle, about lifestyle changes and limitations, about a future that would look very different from the past. Ryan was already there, of course. He'd been there since the ambulance arrived at the store, since the paramedics had worked on Dad right there between the paint cans and lawnmower displays, while customers watched in shocked silence. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the space of a day, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in the hospital chair, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and worry. For the first time in years, our petty rivalries seemed insignificant. We sat on opposite sides of Dad's bed, taking turns holding his hand, sharing coffee from the vending machine, and talking in whispers about doctor's reports and treatment options. Emma drove down from Columbus, where she was teaching 2nd grade, and the three of us fell back into the familiar pattern of being Bob Davis's children, united in our love for the man who had shaped us all. Dad recovered slowly over the following weeks, but the heart attack had changed more than just his physical health. He couldn't work the long hours that had defined his life for 4 decades. He couldn't lift heavy inventory or handle the physical demands that running a hardware store required. For the first time since he'd inherited the business from his own father, Bob Davis had to acknowledge that his body was no longer equal to his will. The conversation about succession happened gradually, in fragments spread across family dinners and bedside visits. Dad never explicitly said he was ready to retire, but the implications hung in the air like morning fog over the Cedar River. Ryan was the obvious choice to take over completely. He'd been essentially running the day-to-day operations for years, he understood every aspect of the business, and he had the trust of customers and suppliers alike. But Dad surprised us all with his proposal. "Ryan, you'll take over as owner and manager," he announced one Sunday evening in early May. "But Marcus, I want you to consider coming home when your current assignment ends. The business is big enough now for 2 partners, and you've got leadership skills that could help us expand in ways I never imagined." I stared at him across the dining room table, unsure I'd heard correctly. "Dad, I'm career military. I'm halfway to retirement. I can't just walk away from 15 years of service." "I'm not asking you to walk away from anything," he replied gently. I'm asking you to consider what comes next. You've served with honor, son. You've proven everything you set out to prove. But someday, the Army won't need you anymore. When that day comes, it would mean a lot to me to know that both my boys were working together to carry on what your grandfather started. Ryan's reaction was immediate and explosive. You want him to waltz back in here and take half of everything I've built? Everything I've sacrificed for? He chose the Army, Dad. He chose to leave. The store is mine. The store will be yours, Dad said firmly. I'm not talking about taking anything away from you. I'm talking about adding to what you've already accomplished. Marcus has learned things in the Army that could benefit the business. Leadership, logistics, personnel management. Think about it, son. Instead of competing with each other, you could be building something together. I could see the wheels turning in Ryan's mind, and I could see that he wasn't reaching the same conclusion that Dad hoped for. In his eyes, this wasn't an opportunity for collaboration. This was a threat to everything he'd worked toward since I'd left for basic training. This was Dad's way of ensuring that the prodigal son would still get his share of the inheritance, despite having abandoned the family business for military glory. I need time to think about this, I said carefully, trying to diffuse the tension that was building in the room. My current commitment runs through 2014. We don't have to make any decisions right now. But the seed had been planted, and I could see it taking root in Ryan's mind as a weed rather than a flower. Over the following months, as Dad's health stabilized and life returned to something resembling normal, I noticed subtle changes in my brother's behavior. He was cordial during family gatherings but distant. He shared updates about the business in general terms, but stopped including me in discussions about future plans. Most tellingly, he began referring to Davis Family Hardware as my store, rather than our store or the family store. Emma noticed the shift too. During a phone call in July, she voiced the concern that had been nagging at all of us. Marcus, I'm worried about Ryan. Ever since Dad brought up the partnership idea, he's been different. More possessive, more defensive. I think he sees you as a threat now instead of his brother. I never asked Dad to include me in the business, I replied. I never even hinted that I wanted to come back to Cedar Falls after the Army. This was his idea. I know that, and deep down, Ryan knows it too. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things. He spent the last decade building his identity around being the son who stayed, the one who carried on the family tradition. Now Dad's suggesting that maybe what he's built isn't complete without you, and that's got to sting. Emma was right, but I didn't know what to do about it. I couldn't control Dad's wishes or Ryan's insecurities. All I could do was continue serving with honor and hope that time would heal whatever wounds had been reopened by Dad's well-intentioned suggestion. My promotion to lieutenant colonel was approved in September 2012, with the ceremony scheduled for the following March. It was a significant milestone, one that validated everything I'd worked toward since that conversation with Sergeant Torres, 15 years earlier. When I called home to share the news, the family's reactions were telling. Mom was thrilled, of course, asking a dozen questions about the ceremony and whether she could bring her camera. Emma was equally excited, already making plans to drive down from Columbus for the event. Dad's response was more measured but deeply meaningful. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Davis, he said slowly, as if testing how the words sounded. Son, I couldn't be prouder. Your grandfather would have been amazed to know that his great-grandson would achieve field-grade rank. This is a big deal, Marcus. A really big deal. Ryan's congratulations came last and felt forced. That's great, Marcus. Really great. I'm sure it's everything you've worked for. The words were right, but the tone was wrong. There was no warmth in his voice, no genuine happiness for my achievement. Instead, there was something that sounded almost like resignation, as if my promotion was just another piece of evidence that I was the son who got to pursue his dreams while he shouldered the family responsibilities. The date for my promotion ceremony was set for March 15, 2013, to be held at Fort Leavenworth. But 2 weeks before the scheduled event, I received a call that would change everything. Lieutenant Colonel Davis? The voice on the phone was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. This is Colonel Martinez from Pentagon Personnel. I need to inform you that your promotion ceremony has been postponed, pending a review of your service record. My heart stopped. Sir, can you tell me what kind of review? Is there some kind of problem? I'm not at liberty to discuss the details over the phone, Major. You'll need to report to your commanding officer for a full briefing. The review is routine, but it needs to be completed before we can proceed with your promotion. Routine. The word echoed in my head as I hung up the phone. Nothing about this felt routine. Promotion delays weren't unheard of, but they were usually related to administrative issues or security clearance updates. The fact that they were specifically reviewing my service record suggested something more serious. The briefing with my commanding officer the next morning did nothing to ease my concerns. Colonel Peterson was a straight shooter who'd always been supportive of my career, but his expression was grave as he explained what little he knew about the situation. Marcus, there's been a complaint filed regarding your conduct during the Ramadi incident in 2008. Someone has alleged that you violated rules of engagement and endangered civilian lives during the convoy ambush. I stared at him in disbelief. Sir, that's impossible. The after-action report was thoroughly reviewed. I was recommended for a Bronze Star for my actions that day. How can someone be questioning it now, 5 years later? I don't know the details, and frankly, I don't understand the timing either. But the complaint has triggered a formal investigation. Until that investigation is complete, your promotion is on hold. The next few weeks were a nightmare of uncertainty and bureaucratic limbo. I was interviewed multiple times by investigators who asked detailed questions about events that had happened half a decade earlier. I provided my recollections, supported by contemporary reports and witness statements. But the process felt like being slowly dissected by people who hadn't been there, who couldn't understand the split-second decisions that combat requires. The worst part was the isolation. Pentagon investigations are confidential by nature, which meant I couldn't discuss the details with anyone, not even my family. When Mom called to ask about final arrangements for the promotion ceremony, I had to tell her it had been postponed indefinitely, due to administrative issues. The disappointment in her voice was heartbreaking. Ryan's reaction was different. When I called to inform him about the delay, there was something in his tone that I couldn't quite identify. Not sympathy, not concern, but something that almost sounded like satisfaction. That's too bad, Marcus. I'm sure it'll get sorted out eventually. These things usually do. It was the casualness of his response that bothered me most. This was potentially career-ending situation, and he sounded like he was discussing a delayed shipment of garden hoses. The investigation dragged on for 2 months before I finally received word that I'd been cleared of all allegations. The complaint, it turned out, had been filed by a disgruntled soldier who'd been court-martialed for desertion and was attempting to discredit the officers who'd testified against him. The allegations were completely without merit, and the Pentagon formally apologized for the delay in my promotion. But the damage had been done. The stress of the investigation had taken its toll, and the experience had planted seeds of doubt about my future in the military. More troubling was the growing distance I felt from my family. During the 2 months of uncertainty, their support had felt lukewarm at best. Mom and Emma had been sympathetic but seemed to accept my vague explanations without pressing for details. Dad had offered quiet encouragement, but seemed more focused on his own health issues than my career crisis. And Ryan had seemed almost relieved that my promotion had been delayed, as if my temporary setback somehow validated his own choices. When my promotion ceremony was finally rescheduled for June 2013, I decided to keep it simple. A small ceremony at Fort Leavenworth, with just my immediate family in attendance. No big celebration, no VFW hall gathering, just a quiet acknowledgement of a milestone that had been overshadowed by months of investigation and doubt. The ceremony itself was everything I'd hoped it would be. Colonel Peterson administered the oath. My family watched with pride as the lieutenant colonel rank was pinned to my uniform, and for a brief moment, everything felt right with the world. Dad looked stronger than he had in months, Mom cried happy tears, and Emma beamed with the kind of joy that reminded me why family mattered more than anything else. But even in that moment of triumph, I noticed Ryan's expression. He was present, he was appropriately congratulatory, but there was something hollow about his participation. He went through the motions of celebrating my achievement, but his heart wasn't in it. It was as if he was watching a performance rather than participating in his brother's success. The dinner afterward was pleasant, but strained. We talked about safe topics: Emma's students, Mom's garden, Dad's gradual recovery. But there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't ignore. When Ryan excused himself early, claiming he needed to get back to the store, I knew something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. Over the following year, that shift became more pronounced. Family phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Holiday visits felt more obligatory than joyful. Ryan was never openly hostile, but he'd erected walls that seemed to grow higher with each passing month. The breaking point came in early 2014, when Dad suffered another heart episode and was hospitalized for 3 days. I took emergency leave and flew home immediately, prepared to do whatever the family needed. But when I arrived at the hospital, I found Ryan already deep in conversations with doctors and administrators, making decisions about Dad's care without consulting me or even informing me of the options being considered. "I've got this handled," he said when I tried to join the discussion with Dad's cardiologist. "You don't need to worry about it." "Ryan, he's my father too. I want to understand what's happening and what the treatment options are." "Your father?" he repeated, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "Right. The father you see maybe 3 times a year. The father whose business you walked away from. The father whose wishes you ignored when you chose the army over family." The argument that followed was quiet but vicious, conducted in hospital whispers that somehow made the words cut deeper than if we'd been shouting. Ryan accused me of being an absent son who showed up only when it was convenient. I accused him of using Dad's illness to assert control over family decisions. We said things to each other that couldn't be taken back, revealed resentments that had been festering for years. Emma arrived just as our argument was reaching its peak. She took one look at our faces and immediately stepped between us. "Stop it," she hissed. "Both of you, stop it right now. Dad is lying in a hospital bed 20 feet away, and you're acting like children fighting over a toy. Whatever issues you have with each other, you will deal with them later. Right now, we're going to be a family, and we're going to support each other through this crisis." Her intervention forced us to call a truce, but the damage had been done. The illusion that we were still brothers who happened to disagree about career choices had been shattered. Now it was clear that Ryan saw me as a threat to everything he'd built and everything he valued. And I was beginning to see that no amount of military success would ever be enough to bridge the gap between us. Dad recovered from that episode, but he was frailer afterward, more dependent on others for tasks he'd once handled effortlessly. The conversations about business succession became more urgent, and Dad's desire to see his sons working together became more pronounced. But every mention of partnership or collaboration seemed to drive Ryan further away from the possibility of reconciliation. In August 2014, I made a decision that I thought might help ease the tension. I requested a transfer to a position that would allow me to spend more time close to home. When the opportunity arose to serve as executive officer for a National Guard unit based in Columbus, I submitted my application immediately. It would mean a slight step back in terms of career progression, but it would put me within 2 hours of Cedar Falls and allow me to be more present for family emergencies. When I called home to share the news, the reactions were mixed. Mom was delighted at the prospect of seeing me more regularly. Emma was thrilled that I'd be close enough for weekend visits. Dad was quietly pleased, though he was careful not to express any expectations about my future involvement in the family business. Ryan's response was immediate and concerning. "So you're coming back," he said, his voice flat. "Just like that. After 15 years of being too good for small-town Ohio, you're coming back." "I'm taking a position in Columbus, Ryan. That's hardly coming back to Cedar Falls." "I'm just trying to be closer to family." "Right. Closer to family. Closer to the business. Closer to whatever inheritance you think you deserve." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? I've never asked for anything from the family business. I've never even expressed interest in working there." "You don't have to ask, Marcus. Dad makes it clear every time we talk that he's hoping you'll come home and help run things. Every conversation, every family dinner, it's always about how much the business could benefit from your leadership skills, your military experience, your superior education." I realized then that Ryan's resentment ran much deeper than I'd understood. This wasn't just about sibling rivalry or career jealousy. This was about identity, about worth, about a lifetime of feeling like he was the consolation prize while I was the family's great hope for the future. Ryan, I never meant for any of this to happen. I never asked Dad to consider me for the business. I never tried to diminish what you've accomplished. Maybe not intentionally, he replied, but intentions don't matter when the results are the same. Every success you achieve makes what I've done seem smaller, less significant. You're a war hero, a decorated officer, a leader of men. I sell hammers and lawnmowers in the same store where I grew up. Do you see the problem? I did see the problem, but I didn't know how to fix it. How do you convince someone that their achievements matter when they've convinced themselves that they're living in your shadow? How do you repair a relationship when the very foundation of your identity seems to threaten theirs? My transfer to Columbus was approved for January 2015, and I spent the final months of 2014 preparing for the move while trying to navigate the increasingly tense family dynamics. Dad's health continued to decline gradually, making conversations about the future more urgent but also more fraught. Ryan had assumed full operational control of the business, but he seemed to interpret every suggestion or observation as an attempt to undermine his authority. The situation reached a crisis point during Christmas dinner 2014. Dad had been talking about expansion plans, about the possibility of opening a second location in the county's seat, when he made the mistake of asking for my opinion about logistics and personnel management. Marcus has experience with complex operations, Dad said innocently. What do you think, son? How would you approach staffing a second location? Before I could respond, Ryan's fork clattered against his plate. There it is again, he said, his voice rising despite Mom's warning glances. Every single conversation, every family gathering, every discussion about the business, it always comes back to what Marcus thinks, what Marcus would do, how Marcus would handle it. Ryan, please, Mom said quietly. It's Christmas. No, Mom, this needs to be said. I've been running this business successfully for 5 years. I've increased revenues by 40%, expanded our customer base, modernized our inventory systems, and built relationships with suppliers that Dad never dreamed of. But none of that matters because Marcus has military experience, so obviously he knows better than the guy who's actually been doing the work. Dad's face went pale. Son, that's not what I meant at all. I value your input above anyone else's. I was just curious about Marcus's perspective on personnel issues. Of course you were, Ryan said bitterly. Just like you're curious about his perspective on everything else. Just like you've been hoping for years that he'll come home and save the business from my incompetent management. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at her plate, clearly wishing she could disappear. Mom looked like she might cry, and Dad sat frozen, realizing that his innocent question had exposed wounds that had been festering for years. I tried to salvage the situation. Ryan, you've done incredible things with the store. I could never have accomplished what you've accomplished. I don't know anything about retail operations or customer relations or inventory management. If Dad values my perspective on anything, it's only because military experience gives me a different point of view, not a better one. But Ryan was beyond hearing reassurances. Different but better, right? That's what you all think. That's what this family has always thought. Ryan's good enough to mind the store, while the real son goes off to do important things in the important world. He stood up abruptly, throwing his napkin onto his untouched plate. I'm done pretending that we're all one big, happy family. Marcus made his choice 15 years ago. He chose the army over us. Fine. But he doesn't get to come back now and claim his share of what I've built in his absence. Katie, who had been silently watching the exchange, finally spoke up. Ryan, honey, maybe we should just go home. Let everyone calm down and talk about this later. But Ryan wasn't finished. He turned to face me directly, his eyes burning with years of accumulated resentment. You want to know what the real problem is, Marcus? The problem is that no matter what I do, no matter how hard I work, no matter how successful I make this business, I'll always be the son who stayed home while his brother went off to become a hero. I'll always be second best in this family, and everyone knows it. With that, he walked out, leaving the rest of us sitting around the Christmas table in stunned silence. Katie followed after a brief apology, and Emma excused herself shortly after. I sat with Mom and Dad in the wreckage of what should have been a celebration, trying to understand how we'd arrived at this point, and wondering if there was any way to repair the damage that had been done. That Christmas dinner marked the end of any pretense that Ryan and I were simply brothers with different career paths. From that point forward, we were adversaries, and the battle lines had been drawn. I moved to Columbus in January 2015, taking on my new role with the National Guard while maintaining my residence and official military records. But every interaction with my family was now colored by the knowledge that my very presence was seen as a threat to Ryan's identity and achievements. The worst part was watching the effect our conflict had on the rest of the family. Dad's health continued to decline, exacerbated by the stress of seeing his sons at war with each other. Mom tried desperately to play peacemaker, but her efforts only seemed to make both of us feel worse about the situation. Emma maintained relationships with both of us, but I could see the toll it was taking on her to be caught in the middle of a battle she hadn't chosen and couldn't resolve. As 2015 progressed, family gatherings became increasingly rare and increasingly tense. Ryan and I maintained a facade of civility for Mom and Dad's sake, but the underlying hostility was impossible to ignore. Conversations were stilted, interactions were formal, and any mention of future plans was carefully avoided. It was during this period of family dysfunction that the seeds of my ultimate vindication were being planted, though I wouldn't know it for years. The classified file containing information about the Ramadi incident had been reviewed as part of a broader Pentagon initiative to declassify historical operational reports. The review had confirmed not only that my actions were correct, but that they had prevented a much larger catastrophe that would have resulted in significant civilian casualties. But that information remained locked away in government files while my family continued to fracture along lines that seemed irreparable. Ryan's resentment deepened into something approaching hatred, and my attempts to bridge the gap only seemed to confirm his suspicions that I was trying to reclaim a place in the family hierarchy that I'd forfeited years earlier. The stage was set for the confrontation that would either destroy our family completely or force us to finally confront the truth about who we really were and what we really meant to each other. But first, I had to survive the darkest period of my military career, when everything I'd built would be called into question, and I'd have to fight not just for my reputation, but for my very identity, as a soldier and as a man. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in February 2016. I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours after a long day of training exercises with the National Guard unit, when my phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand. Mom's name on the display sent ice through my veins, because nobody calls at 3 a.m. with good news. Marcus. Her voice was barely a whisper, shaking with grief I'd never heard before. Your father's gone, honey. He went peacefully in his sleep, but he's gone. The drive from Columbus to Cedar Falls that night was the longest 2 hours of my life. I kept thinking about all the conversations we'd never have, all the wisdom he'd never get to share, all the family problems he'd never get to help solve. Dad had been the anchor that kept us all connected, the voice of reason that could calm any storm. Without him, I wasn't sure what would hold the Davis family together. The funeral home was already busy when I arrived, despite the early hour. Small towns mobilize quickly when they lose someone like Bob Davis, and by sunrise there was a steady stream of neighbors, customers, and old army buddies paying their respects. Ryan was there, of course, handling arrangements with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. We nodded to each other across the room but didn't speak. Even in grief, the gulf between us felt insurmountable. Emma drove down from Columbus as soon as her principal could arrange a substitute teacher. She looked exhausted and heartbroken, but she immediately took charge of coordinating with the church, managing the flower deliveries, and fielding the constant phone calls from people who wanted to help. Watching her navigate the logistics of loss, I realized that somewhere along the way, my little sister had become the strongest person in our family. The visitation lasted 3 days, and it seemed like half of Ohio passed through Muller's funeral home to pay their respects. Dad had touched more lives than I'd realized, and every person had a story about his kindness, his integrity, his willingness to help when help was needed. Veterans from 3 different wars came to honor a brother in arms. Customers shared memories of Dad going out of his way to solve their problems, often at his own expense. Church members talked about his quiet leadership and unwavering faith. But it was the stories from his employees that hit me hardest. People who'd worked at the hardware store for decades talked about Dad as more than a boss, more than an employer. He'd been a mentor, a father figure, a man who cared about their families and their futures. Several mentioned that he'd paid for their children's school supplies or helped them through financial emergencies without ever expecting recognition or repayment. Ryan stood beside the casket for hours each day, accepting condolences and sharing memories with a steady stream of visitors. To everyone else, he was the grieving son who'd carried on his father's legacy. But I could see the weight he was carrying, the pressure of being the one everyone expected to hold things together. Every handshake, every hug, every expression of sympathy came with an unspoken expectation that he would continue to be the Bob Davis that Cedar Falls needed. The funeral service was held at Cedar Falls Methodist, the same church where Dad had taught Sunday school for 23 years. Pastor Williams delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of who Dad had been, not just as a businessman or a veteran, but as a man who understood that life's true measure comes from how you treat the people around you. The church was packed, with an overflow crowd standing in the back and spilling out into the vestibule. Emma spoke on behalf of the family, her voice steady and strong despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. She talked about Dad's love for his children, his pride in their different accomplishments, his belief that success could take many forms as long as it was built on integrity and service to others. She shared stories that made people laugh and memories that made them cry, painting a picture of a man who'd lived his values every single day. Ryan and I served as pallbearers, along with 4 of Dad's closest friends, carrying his casket from the church to the hearse, with the same careful coordination we'd once brought to helping him move inventory in the store. For those few minutes, walking in step behind our father's remains, we were just 2 sons saying goodbye to the man who'd shaped us both. The anger and resentment that had divided us seemed trivial in the face of such profound loss. The graveside service was smaller, limited to family and close friends. As the honor guard fired their 3-volley salute and a bugler played taps, I thought about all the military funerals Dad had attended over the years, all the fallen comrades he'd honored with his presence. Now it was his turn to receive that final tribute, and I was proud that his service to his country was being recognized alongside his service to his community. After the burial, people gathered at the VFW hall for a meal and more shared memories. The hall was decorated with photos spanning Dad's entire life, his wedding to Mom, his military service, the early days of the hardware store, family vacations, and countless community events. Looking at those pictures, I realized how much history he represented, how many lives he'd influenced, how much knowledge and wisdom had been lost with his passing. Ryan and I found ourselves standing together in front of a display of Dad's military memorabilia, including his Purple Heart and Bronze Star from Vietnam. For a moment, the old animosity between us seemed to fade, as we both contemplated the legacy we'd inherited. "He was proud of you, you know," Ryan said quietly, his voice barely audible above the conversations happening around us. "Your military service, your promotions, everything you've accomplished." He talked about it constantly. I looked at my brother, surprised by the admission. "He was proud of you too, Ryan. Prouder than you probably realize. He used to tell people that you'd taken his simple hardware store and turned it into something he never could have imagined." Ryan nodded slowly, but I could see the pain in his eyes. Maybe, but it was never enough, was it? No matter what I accomplished with the business, no matter how successful I made it, there was always this sense that I was just keeping the seat warm until you decided to come home and claim your rightful place. The honesty of his words hit me like a physical blow. "Ryan, I never wanted to take anything from you. I never even thought about coming back to the store until Dad brought it up. This was always your domain, your success." "But, don't you see?" he replied, his voice taking on the familiar edge of resentment. "It doesn't matter what you wanted or didn't want. It matters what everyone else expected. Dad, Mom, half the town, they all assumed that eventually you'd come home and we'd run the business together. Every conversation about the future included you, even when you weren't here, even when you'd made it clear that your life was somewhere else." Before I could respond, Emma appeared beside us, her eyes red from crying but her expression determined. "We need to talk," she said firmly. "All three of us. Not here, not now, but soon. Dad's gone, and we're all that's left. We can either figure out how to be a family again, or we can let his death be the final thing that tears us apart." The conversation Emma demanded took place a week after the funeral, in the living room of the family home where we'd grown up. Mom had gone to stay with her sister in Toledo for a few days, needing space to grieve without the constant reminders of life with Dad. The house felt empty and hollow without his presence, like a stage set after the actors had gone home. Emma started the conversation with characteristic directness. "I'm going to say some things that probably need to be said, and I don't want either of you to interrupt until I'm finished. We've lost Dad, and that's terrible and heartbreaking, and nothing will ever be the same. But what's even worse is watching the two of you destroy each other over things that don't really matter." She looked directly at Ryan. "You think Marcus doesn't appreciate what you've done with the store, but that's not true. You think everyone sees you as the lesser son, but that's not true either. You've built something incredible, something Dad was amazingly proud of, something that stands on its own merit regardless of what anyone else has accomplished." Then she turned to me. "And you think you can just show up for holidays and graduations and expect everything to be the same as it was when we were kids. You think you can pursue your dreams without any consequences for the family you left behind. But every choice has a cost, Marcus, and part of the cost of your success has been watching your brother struggle with feelings of inadequacy that you helped create, even if you didn't mean to." The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken truths. Emma wasn't finished. "Dad wanted us to work together because he believed we were stronger as a team than as individuals. Maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong, but we'll never know because neither of you has ever been willing to really try. Instead, you've spent years competing over things that don't matter, measuring your worth against each other instead of against your own potential." Ryan spoke first, his voice subdued. "Emma, it's not that simple. You don't understand what it's like to live in someone's shadow your entire life. Every achievement I've had, every success I've earned, it gets diminished because Marcus exists. He's the war hero, the decorated officer, the one who went out and conquered the world. I'm just the guy who stayed home and sold hardware." "That's not how I see you," I said quietly. "That's not how anyone sees you, Ryan. You've created something remarkable with the store. You've built relationships, served the community, provided jobs for people who depend on you. That's not lesser than military service, it's just different." "Different but not equal," Ryan replied bitterly. "Let's be honest, Marcus. When people talk about the Davis family, they mention the hardware store as background context before they get to the real story, which is your military career. I'm the footnote to your biography." Emma stood up abruptly, her patience finally exhausted. "Stop it. Both of you, just stop it. Dad is dead, and you're sitting here arguing about who gets more recognition, who's more important, who's more successful. Do you think Dad cared about any of that? Do you think he spent his last years worrying about which son was getting more attention?" She was right, and we both knew it. Dad had measured success by different standards: integrity, service, family, community. By those measures, both Ryan and I had reason to be proud of what we'd accomplished. But somehow we'd gotten lost in a competition that Dad had never wanted us to have. The conversation continued for hours, sometimes heated, sometimes tearful, but always honest in a way we hadn't been with each other in years. We talked about childhood resentments and adult disappointments, about expectations and assumptions, about the ways we'd hurt each other without meaning to. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a tentative step toward understanding each other's perspectives. By the time we finished talking, it was nearly midnight. We were all emotionally drained, but there was something different in the air between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but at least acknowledgement. Ryan and I shook hands before he left, a formal gesture that felt significant despite its awkwardness. "We should do this more often," he said as he stood to leave. "Talk, I mean. Really talk instead of just going through the motions at family gatherings." I agreed, and for a moment I thought we might actually be able to rebuild the relationship we'd lost. But I underestimated how deep Ryan's resentment ran, and how much the loss of Dad would affect his sense of identity and purpose. Without Dad's stabilizing presence, the tentative peace we'd negotiated that night would prove to be more fragile than any of us realized. The reading of Dad's will took place 2 weeks later in the office of his longtime attorney, Harold Brennan. It was a formality more than anything else, since Dad had discussed his intentions with us multiple times over the years. The hardware store and all its assets would go to Ryan, who had earned them through years of dedicated service. The family home would go to Mom, with the understanding that it would eventually be divided among the 3 children. Emma and I would receive modest financial bequests, enough to be meaningful but not enough to change our lives dramatically. What none of us expected was the letter Dad had left to be read aloud after the formal will had been reviewed. Harold Brennan cleared his throat and began reading in his careful legal cadence. To my children, Ryan, Marcus, and Emma. If you're hearing this, then I've moved on to whatever comes next, and you're left to figure out how to be a family without me. I hope I've taught you enough about love and forgiveness and the importance of blood ties that you'll find a way to stay connected despite your differences. The letter went on for several paragraphs, sharing Dad's hopes for each of us and his memories of our childhood together. But it was the final section that would haunt me for months to come. To Ryan, you have built something remarkable with the store, something that far exceeds anything I ever imagined. Your success is yours alone, earned through hard work and dedication and genuine care for our customers and community. I hope you understand that my pride in your accomplishments has nothing to do with Marcus's choices and everything to do with who you are as a man and as my son. To Marcus, your service to our country has brought honor to our family name and fulfilled dreams I had for you since you were a little boy reading military history books. But more than your rank or your medals, I'm proud of the leader you've become and the integrity you've maintained even when it would have been easier to compromise. And to all 3 of you, I want you to remember that success isn't a competition, especially within a family. Each of you has found your own path to making a difference in the world. Don't diminish your own achievements by comparing them to your siblings, and don't let pride or jealousy rob you of the love and support that should define your relationships with each other. The letter concluded with specific instructions for a memorial fund Dad wanted established to help local veterans and their families, funded by proceeds from the sale of some stock investments he'd kept private during his lifetime. It was typical of Dad to think about others even in his final wishes, to find a way to help people who might be struggling with transitions from military to civilian life. After the will reading, Ryan seemed more settled, more at peace with his inheritance and his role as the primary keeper of Dad's legacy. The letter had given him something he'd been seeking for years: explicit recognition from Dad that his achievements stood on their own merit, independent of anything I had done or might do in the future. For a few weeks it seemed like the family might actually be healing. Ryan and I talked more regularly, sharing memories of Dad and coordinating on details related to his estate. Emma continued her teaching job but made an effort to visit Cedar Falls more frequently, helping Mom adjust to life as a widow while maintaining connections with both of her brothers. But the peace proved to be temporary. As spring turned to summer, I began to notice changes in Ryan's behavior that concerned me. He became more controlling about family decisions, more possessive of Dad's memory, more insistent that he was now the head of the Davis family by virtue of his role as keeper of the family business. Small disagreements became major arguments, and every difference of opinion was treated as a challenge to his authority. The breaking point came in August, when the local VFW asked me to speak at their annual fundraising dinner. It was a routine request, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times over the years. As a field-grade officer with combat experience, I was often asked to speak at veterans events, military ceremonies, and patriotic celebrations. I accepted the invitation without thinking much about it, mentioning it casually to Ryan during a phone conversation about Mom's birthday plans. His reaction was immediate and explosive. "Of course they asked you," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Of course it's Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Davis they want to hear from. Not the guy who's actually been supporting the VFW for 20 years. Not the person who's been organizing their fundraisers and volunteering at their events since he was old enough to work. No, they want the war hero, the decorated officer, the Davis son who actually matters." I tried to calm him down. "Ryan, it's just a speaking engagement. It doesn't mean anything more than that. You've done 10 times more for the VFW than I ever have. But I'm not the one they want to hear from, am I? I'm not the one whose opinion matters, whose experiences are worth sharing. I'm just the local businessman who writes checks and shows up to work their events. But when they want someone to inspire people, they call you. The conversation deteriorated from there, devolving into another rehashing of old grievances and perceived slights. Ryan accused me of seeking attention and glory at the expense of the family's reputation. I accused him of being unable to separate his personal insecurities from legitimate recognition of military service. We both said things that would have broken Dad's heart, things that widened the gap between us even further. The VFW speech went well, focusing on the importance of supporting veterans' transitions to civilian life and the role that strong communities play in helping former service members find their place in post-military careers. I talked about Dad's example as a veteran who'd successfully built a meaningful life after war, and about the obligation we all have to help other veterans find similar paths to purpose and fulfillment. But the positive reception of the speech only seemed to make things worse with Ryan. Over the following weeks, he began making subtle comments about my celebrity status in town, about how people treated me differently because of my military rank, about how my presence overshadowed other family members who'd made equally important contributions to the community. The final straw came during a family barbecue at Mom's house in September. I'd driven down from Columbus for Emma's birthday, bringing her a gift and looking forward to a relaxing afternoon with family. But the mood was tense from the moment I arrived, with Ryan making snide comments about my busy schedule and my important military obligations. The explosion happened when Mom mentioned that she'd received a call from the local newspaper wanting to do a feature story about the Davis family's contribution to the community over 3 generations. She was excited about the prospect, seeing it as a way to honor Dad's memory and celebrate the family's legacy. They want to interview all of us, she said happily. 3 generations of Davises, from Grandpa William founding the store, to Ryan building it into what it is today, to Marcus serving his country with distinction. I think Dad would have loved seeing his family recognized like this. Ryan's reaction was swift and decisive. No, he said flatly. Absolutely not. I'm not participating in some puff piece that's really just an excuse to write another story about Marcus's military career. Mom looked confused. Honey, it's about the whole family. It's about Dad's legacy and what we've all accomplished. Is it, Mom? Or is it about how the Davis family produced a decorated war hero? Because let me tell you how this story will go. Local family has long tradition of service. Son becomes Army officer. The hardware store will get maybe 2 paragraphs. And my 20 years of building this business will be reduced to a footnote before they get to the real story, which is Colonel Davis and his medals, and his inspiring military career. Emma tried to intervene. Ryan, you're being paranoid. The reporter specifically mentioned wanting to focus on the business and its role in the community. They say that, Ryan replied angrily. But we all know how it'll actually be written. Marcus is the story, the rest of us are just background characters in his biography. I finally spoke up, my own patience exhausted. Ryan, if you don't want to do the interview, don't do it. But stop making this about me. I didn't call the newspaper. I didn't ask for any publicity. And I honestly don't care whether they write a story or not. Of course you don't care, he shot back. You get plenty of attention already. Every veterans event, every patriotic celebration, every time someone in this town wants to hear about real service and real sacrifice, they call Lieutenant Colonel Davis. Meanwhile, the rest of us just fade into the background, supporting players in the Marcus Davis show. That's when I made the mistake that would set everything in motion toward our ultimate confrontation. Instead of walking away, instead of ending the conversation before it got worse, I let my own frustration override my better judgment. You know what, Ryan? You're right. I do get asked to speak at events. I do get recognized for my military service. And people do treat me with respect because of my rank and my combat experience. But you know what else? I earned every bit of that recognition. I spent 15 years serving my country, I led soldiers in combat, I made life and death decisions under fire, and I've sacrificed more for my career than you'll ever understand. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. I saw immediately that I'd crossed a line, that I'd confirmed every fear and resentment Ryan had been nursing for years. But it was too late to take them back. Ryan stood up slowly, his face pale with rage. "There it is," he said quietly. "There's what you really think. That what you've done matters more than what I've done. That your sacrifices are more meaningful than mine. That you're the real Davis son, and I'm just the one who wasn't brave enough to leave home." Emma was crying now, and Mom looked like she might be sick. The birthday celebration was ruined, the family gathering was destroyed, and the fragile peace we'd built after Dad's death was shattered beyond repair. Ryan gathered his things and left without another word, Katie following behind with an apologetic glance at the rest of us. I sat in Mom's living room, surrounded by the wreckage of what should have been a celebration, knowing that I'd just destroyed any hope of reconciliation with my brother. That night marked the beginning of the darkest period of my relationship with my family. Ryan stopped taking my calls, stopped responding to my emails, and made it clear through Emma that he considered our relationship over. Mom tried to mediate, but her efforts only seemed to make both of us feel worse about the situation. Emma continued to maintain relationships with both of us, but I could see the toll it was taking on her to be caught in the middle of a war she couldn't stop. As 2016 drew to a close, I found myself more isolated from my family than I'd ever been, even during my deployments overseas. The distance wasn't just geographical now, it was emotional, spiritual, fundamental. Ryan and I weren't just brothers who disagreed about things, we were enemies. And the battle between us was about to escalate in ways that would test everything we both built and believed about ourselves. The stage was set for the confrontation that would either destroy us completely or force us to finally face the truth about who we really were and what family really meant. But before that reckoning could come, I would have to endure the most humiliating and painful experience of my military career, an experience that would strip away every assumption I'd made about success, recognition, and my own place in the world. The promotion ceremony that was supposed to change everything was scheduled for March 15, 2017, at the VFW Hall in Cedar Falls. It had been my idea to hold it there instead of at a military installation. I thought it would be a way to honor Dad's memory, to bring the family together, to show the community that military service and hometown values could coexist beautifully. Looking back, it was probably the most naive decision I'd ever made. The paperwork for my promotion to full colonel had been approved 6 months earlier, but I'd requested the delay to coordinate with my new assignment as Deputy Commander of the Ohio National Guard's 38th Infantry Division. It was a significant step up in responsibility, overseeing training and readiness for nearly 10,000 soldiers across the state. More importantly to me, it was a position that would keep me based in Ohio, close enough to family to be present for whatever came next. Mom was thrilled about the ceremony. She'd spent weeks coordinating with the VFW Ladies Auxiliary to plan a reception afterward, complete with a cake decorated with Colonel's eagles and a display of Dad's military memorabilia alongside my own service records. Emma had requested a substitute teacher so she could drive down from Columbus with her boyfriend Derek, whom she'd been dating for 2 years and seemed increasingly serious about. Even some of my old Army buddies had promised to make the trip to Ohio for the occasion. The only person who remained conspicuously absent from the planning was Ryan. I'd called him personally to invite him to the ceremony, swallowing my pride and hoping that the significance of the occasion might bridge the gap that had opened between us. The conversation was brief and painful. "Ryan, I know things have been difficult between us, but this is important to me. It would mean a lot to have my brother there when I pin on Colonel." There was a long pause before he responded. "Congratulations on the promotion, Marcus. I'm sure it's well deserved." "That's not an answer. Will you be there?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'll think about it." He hung up without committing either way, leaving me to wonder whether my own brother would show up for one of the most significant moments of my military career. Emma assured me that he would come through, that family obligations would ultimately overcome personal resentments, but I wasn't so sure. The Ryan I'd grown up with would never have missed something like this, but the Ryan I'd been dealing with for the past few years was a different person entirely. As the date approached, I found myself increasingly nervous about the ceremony itself. Promotion to colonel was a big deal in the military world, representing entry into the senior leadership ranks that shaped policy and strategy at the highest levels. Only about 2% of officers ever achieved that rank, and I was acutely aware of the responsibility and expectations that came with wearing eagles on my collar. But the family dynamics made me more anxious than the professional implications. This ceremony was supposed to be a celebration, a moment when my loved ones could share in my success and take pride in what I'd accomplished. Instead, it felt like walking into a minefield where any wrong step could trigger an explosion that would destroy what little remained of our family relationships. The morning of March 15th dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp air that makes everything seem sharper and more vivid. I put on my dress blue uniform with extra care, checking and rechecking every detail from the placement of my ribbons to the shine on my shoes. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw 15 years of service reflected back. The young second lieutenant who'd shipped out to Afghanistan, the battle-tested captain who'd led soldiers through Iraq, the seasoned major who'd earned his place among the Army's professional officer corps. I arrived at the VFW hall an hour early to help with final preparations. The building had been transformed since the last time I'd been there, with red, white, and blue bunting hanging from the ceiling, and a small stage set up at the front where the ceremony would take place. Tables were arranged in neat rows, and each place setting included a program that Mom had designed featuring photos from my military career, alongside a brief history of the Davis family's service to community and country. Emma arrived shortly after I did, looking elegant in a navy blue dress that she'd bought specifically for the occasion. She gave me a hug that lasted longer than usual, and I could see tears in her eyes as she stepped back to look at me in my dress uniform. "Dad would be so proud," she said softly. "You know that, right? Whatever else happens today, wherever things stand with Ryan, Dad would be bursting with pride to see you pin on Colonel." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to respond. Dad's absence was a physical ache in my chest, a reminder that the person whose approval had mattered most would never get to see this moment. General Thompson arrived 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. He was a man I'd known for several years through various National Guard functions, someone whose reputation for integrity and leadership was legendary throughout the Ohio military community. The fact that he'd agreed to officiate my promotion was both an honor and a vote of confidence in my potential for continued advancement. "Colonel Davis," he said with a smile as he shook my hand. "That has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Are you ready for this?" "Yes, sir, I think so." "Good. I've been looking forward to this ceremony for months. Your service record speaks for itself, and the 38th Infantry Division is lucky to have you as deputy commander." As guests began arriving, I stationed myself near the entrance to greet people and thank them for coming. The turnout was better than I'd expected, with current and former military personnel mixing with family friends, business associates, and community members who'd known the Davis family for decades. Mrs. Henderson, my elementary school teacher, was there, along with several of Dad's old customers from the hardware store. Tom Mitchell, who'd served with Dad in Vietnam, had driven over from the next county specifically for the ceremony. Mom looked radiant in a burgundy dress that complemented her silver hair, playing the role of proud military mother with grace and dignity. She moved through the crowd like a natural hostess, introducing people to each other and sharing stories about my childhood and military career with anyone who would listen. Watching her, I was struck by how much she'd grown into her own strength since Dad's death, how she'd found ways to honor his memory while building her own identity as a widow and community member. 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I still hadn't seen any sign of Ryan. Emma kept glancing toward the door, clearly hoping her older brother would make a last-minute appearance, but I was beginning to accept that he might not show up at all. The disappointment was sharp, but not entirely surprising. Our relationship had deteriorated to the point where even major family milestones weren't enough to overcome the resentment and anger that had built up between us. Then, just as General Thompson was preparing to call everyone to order, the door opened and Ryan walked in. He was wearing a dark suit that I recognized from Dad's funeral, and his expression was carefully neutral, giving no indication of his mood or his intentions. Katie wasn't with him, which suggested that his attendance was motivated by obligation rather than enthusiasm, but he was there. That had to count for something. Our eyes met across the room, and he gave me a slight nod that might have been acknowledgement or might have been politeness. I nodded back, grateful that he'd come despite everything that had happened between us, hoping that maybe this ceremony could mark the beginning of a healing process for our fractured relationship. General Thompson called everyone to attention, and the crowds settled into their seats as the ceremony began. The program was simple but meaningful. The posting of colors by the VFW Honor Guard, the national anthem sung by Emma's friend Sarah from the church choir, and brief remarks by General Thompson about the significance of promotion to colonel and my qualifications for the position. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Thompson said as he gestured for me to join him at the front of the room, "it is my distinct honor to promote Major Marcus Davis to the rank of colonel in the United States Army. Marcus has served with distinction for 15 years, including 2 combat deployments where he demonstrated exceptional leadership under fire. His commitment to excellence and his dedication to the soldiers under his command have earned him the respect of his peers and the admiration of his superiors." I stood at attention as General Thompson read the promotion orders, my heart pounding with a mixture of pride and nervousness. This was it, the moment I'd been working toward since that conversation with Sergeant Torres 20 years ago. Everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd endured, everything I'd built, was leading to this recognition of my place among the Army's senior leadership. "Marcus Davis, do you solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same?" "I do, sir." "Do you swear to well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office of Colonel in the United States Army to the best of your ability, so help you God?" "I do, sir." General Thompson stepped forward to remove the Major's oak leaves from my collar and replace them with the silver eagles that would identify me as a colonel for the rest of my military career. The weight of the new insignia felt both substantial and symbolic, a physical reminder of the increased responsibility and authority that came with the rank. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, with several people rising to their feet in recognition of the moment's significance. I looked out at the crowd and saw genuine happiness on most faces. People who understood that this promotion represented not just personal achievement but also community pride. Mom was crying tears of joy, Emma was beaming with sisterly pride, and even some of Dad's old friends were wiping their eyes as they thought about how much this moment would have meant to him. That's when Ryan stood up. At first I thought he was joining the standing ovation, adding his own recognition to the celebration. But something about his posture, something about the expression on his face, told me that wasn't what was happening. The applause began to fade as people noticed that Ryan wasn't clapping, wasn't smiling, wasn't participating in the celebration at all. "Excuse me," Ryan said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something that needs to be said before we go any further with this celebration." General Thompson looked confused, and I felt ice spreading through my veins as I realized that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be good. The room fell completely silent, with every eye focused on my brother as he stood among the seated guests like an actor taking center stage. "My name is Ryan Davis, and Marcus is my brother," he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall. Over the following months, as Dad's health stabilized and life returned to something resembling normal, I noticed subtle changes in my brother's behavior. He was cordial during family gatherings but distant. He shared updates about the business in general terms, but stopped including me in discussions about future plans. Most tellingly, he began referring to Davis Family Hardware as my store, rather than our store or the family store. Emma noticed the shift too. During a phone call in July, she voiced the concern that had been nagging at all of us. "Marcus, I'm worried about Ryan. Ever since Dad brought up the partnership idea, he's been different. More possessive, more defensive. I think he sees you as a threat now instead of his brother." "I never asked Dad to include me in the business," I replied. "I never even hinted that I wanted to come back to Cedar Falls after the Army. This was his idea. I know that, and deep down, Ryan knows it too. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things. He's spent the last decade building his identity around being the son who stayed, the one who carried on the family tradition. Now Dad's suggesting that maybe what he's built isn't complete without you, and that's got to sting." Emma was right, but I didn't know what to do about it. I couldn't control Dad's wishes or Ryan's insecurities. All I could do was continue serving with honor, and hope that time would heal whatever wounds had been reopened by Dad's well-intentioned suggestion. My promotion to lieutenant colonel was approved in September 2012, with the ceremony scheduled for the following March. It was a significant milestone, one that validated everything I'd worked towards since that conversation with Sergeant Torres, 15 years earlier. When I called home to share the news, the family's reactions were telling. Mom was thrilled, of course, asking a dozen questions about the ceremony and whether she could bring her camera. Emma was equally excited, already making plans to drive down from Columbus for the event. Dad's response was more measured but deeply meaningful. "Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Davis," he said slowly, as if testing how the words sounded. "Son, I couldn't be prouder. Your grandfather would have been amazed to know that his great-grandson would achieve field-grade rank. This is a big deal, Marcus. A really big deal." Ryan's congratulations came last and felt forced. "That's great, Marcus. If you have concerns about your brother's service record, there are proper channels for addressing them. This is neither the time nor the place for such accusations." "Isn't it?" Ryan replied, his confidence growing as he sensed that he had the room's attention. "Isn't this exactly the time and place? You're about to promote him to colonel based on a service record that includes lies and cover-ups. Don't the people here have a right to know what kind of man they're celebrating?" Emma had risen from her seat and was moving toward Ryan, clearly intending to intervene, but he held up his hand to stop her. "I'm sorry, Em, but this has gone on long enough. I've watched this family worship Marcus for years, watched this community treat him like some kind of war hero, and I can't stay silent anymore. Not when I know the truth." I finally found my voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Ryan, please, don't do this. Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you have, we can discuss it privately. Don't destroy everything like this." "Destroy everything?" Ryan's laugh was bitter and harsh. "You destroyed everything years ago, Marcus. You destroyed this family the day you decided that your military career was more important than anything else. You destroyed it when you chose glory over responsibility, when you abandoned the people who needed you to chase recognition and medals and promotions." General Thompson stepped between us, his authority finally asserting itself over the chaos Ryan had created. "That's enough. Mr. Davis, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you have legitimate concerns about Colonel Davis's service record, you can file a formal complaint through proper military channels. But I will not allow you to continue disrupting this ceremony with unsubstantiated accusations." But the damage was already done. The promotion ceremony was over, not in celebration but in scandal and confusion. People were whispering among themselves, shooting glances in my direction that ranged from sympathy to suspicion. Some began gathering their things and heading for the exits, clearly uncomfortable with being witnesses to what felt like a family meltdown disguised as military misconduct allegations. Ryan allowed himself to be escorted toward the door by Tom Mitchell and two other veterans who'd apparently decided to intervene before things got completely out of hand. But as he reached the exit, he turned back for one final shot. "Ask him about Ramadi," he called out loudly enough for everyone remaining to hear. "Ask him what really happened in that marketplace when his soldiers were depending on him to keep them safe. Ask him why good men died because of his decisions." Then he was gone, leaving behind a room full of shocked faces and whispered conversations. I stood at the front of the hall in my dress blue uniform with my brand new Colonel's Eagles, feeling like everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, everything I was had just been ripped away from me in front of the people whose respect mattered most. General Thompson approached me with an expression that combined sympathy with professional concern. "Marcus, I'm going to need you to report to my office first thing Monday morning. We'll need to discuss this situation and determine what steps need to be taken." I nodded numbly, unable to form words. The ceremony that was supposed to mark the pinnacle of my career had become the beginning of what felt like its end. The eagles on my collar suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds each, and I wondered if I would ever get the chance to wear them again. Mom appeared beside me, her face streaked with tears but her voice steady with maternal protectiveness. "Marcus, honey, we're going home. Now. Don't say anything to anyone else. Don't try to explain anything. We're just going to leave with whatever dignity we can salvage. Emma joined us, her arms slipping through mine in a gesture of solidarity that meant more than she could possibly know. Together, the three of us walked through the VFW hall that had been decorated for celebration, but now felt like a crime scene. People stepped aside to let us pass, their expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity to barely concealed excitement at having witnessed such dramatic family dysfunction. The drive to Mom's house passed in complete silence. I sat in the passenger seat of Emma's car, staring out the window at the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, wondering if I would ever be able to show my face in this town again. Every person we passed, every house we drove by represented potential witnesses to my humiliation, people who would now forever associate my name with scandal and doubt rather than service and honor. At Mom's house, we sat around the kitchen table where I'd shared thousands of family meals, where I'd first told my parents about my desire to join the Army, where I'd returned on leave to share stories of deployment and promotion. Now it felt like a war room where we were planning damage control for a crisis that seemed to have no solution. What was he talking about? Emma asked quietly. The Ramadi thing, the documents, all of it. What does Ryan think he knows about your service record? I rubbed my face with both hands, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered and chaotic. I don't know. The Ramadi incident was from 2008 during my deployment to Iraq. There was an IED attack on our convoy, and I had to make some quick decisions about how to respond. Everything was reviewed and approved. I was even recommended for a medal. I have no idea what Ryan thinks he's found, or where he would have gotten any information about it. Could someone have fed him false information? Mom asked. Someone with a grudge against you or against the military in general? It's possible, but I don't know who or why. Ryan's never shown any interest in the details of my military service before. He's complained about the attention I get, sure, but he's never questioned the validity of my record or suggested that I was anything other than an honest soldier. Emma was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing what had happened and what it might mean. Marcus, regardless of whether Ryan's accusations have any merit, you need to understand that this isn't really about your military service. This is about 15 years of resentment and jealousy that finally found a way to express itself. Ryan convinced himself that you were the favored son, the family success story, the one who got all the recognition while he did all the work. Today was his way of tearing you down to his level. I knew she was right, but that understanding didn't make the situation any less devastating. My brother had just destroyed my promotion ceremony and potentially damaged my military career based on what appeared to be personal jealousy rather than legitimate concerns about misconduct. The betrayal cut deeper than any enemy attack I'd faced in combat, because this came from someone who was supposed to love me unconditionally. The phone started ringing almost immediately after we got home. Local reporters who'd heard about the disrupted ceremony, military colleagues who wanted to understand what had happened, community members who were either offering support or fishing for gossip. Mom fielded most of the calls, politely declining comment and asking for privacy during what she described as a difficult family situation. But it was the call from General Thompson's aide that changed everything. Monday morning's meeting had been moved up to Sunday afternoon, and I was ordered to report in dress uniform with all relevant documentation regarding my service record. The investigation into Ryan's allegations was beginning immediately, and my career was officially in jeopardy. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The Colonel's eagles sat on my dresser, catching moonlight from the window and reminding me of how briefly I'd gotten to enjoy the promotion I'd worked toward for so long. Tomorrow would bring meetings with investigators, questions about events from nearly a decade ago, and the possibility that my military career would end not in honor but in disgrace. But more than my career, I was mourning the death of my family. Ryan's actions hadn't just attacked my professional reputation. They'd severed the last remaining bonds between us. There would be no coming back from this, no reconciliation that could overcome the public humiliation he'd inflicted. Whatever we'd once been as brothers was over, destroyed by resentment and jealousy that had finally found their ultimate expression. As I drifted toward an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Ryan had fired the first shot in what felt like a war for the very soul of the Davis family, and I had no idea how to fight back against an enemy who shared my blood and knew all my vulnerabilities. The promotion ceremony that was supposed to be my triumph had become my Waterloo, and I was facing the possibility that everything I'd built might crumble around me, because my own brother had decided that destroying me was more important than preserving our family. The investigation into Ryan's allegations lasted 6 weeks and nearly destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself. General Thompson assigned a team of military investigators to review every aspect of my service record, with particular attention to the Ramadi incident that Ryan had mentioned in his public accusation. I was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome, which meant I couldn't perform my duties as deputy commander while my entire career hung in the balance. The investigators were thorough and professional, but their questions cut deep into memories I'd tried to bury. They wanted to know about every decision I'd made during that ambush in 2008, every order I'd given, every action my soldiers had taken. They interviewed members of my unit who were still in service, reviewed medical reports on the wounded, and analyzed intelligence reports that had been classified for nearly a decade. During those weeks of uncertainty, I learned who my real friends were. Some colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with an officer under investigation. Others rallied around me, offering support and character references that meant more than they could know. Mom and Emma stood by me without question, but the absence of Ryan's support felt like a constant wound that wouldn't heal. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't discuss the details of the investigation with anyone outside the military chain of command, which meant spending long days alone in my apartment, replaying every moment of my career, and wondering if I'd somehow overlooked something that could validate Ryan's accusations. Sleep became elusive, and when it finally came, it brought nightmares that mixed memories of combat with visions of public disgrace. 3 weeks into the investigation, I received an unexpected phone call from Captain Jennifer Torres, now Lieutenant Colonel Torres, the recruiter who'd first inspired me to join the Army 22 years earlier. She'd heard about the investigation through military channels and wanted to offer her support. "Marcus, I've known you since you were 18 years old," she said during our conversation. "I've watched your entire career, and I've never seen anything that would suggest you were anything other than an exemplary officer. Whatever your brother thinks he knows, whatever documents he claims to have, I'm confident the truth will vindicate you." Her words provided some comfort, but they couldn't eliminate the doubt that was eating away at my confidence. Ryan had seemed so certain, so convinced that he had evidence of wrongdoing. Where could such conviction come from if there wasn't at least some basis in reality? The answer came during the 4th week of the investigation, when the lead investigator, Colonel Sarah Martinez, called me into her office with an expression I couldn't read. "Marcus, we've completed our review of the Ramadi incident, and I need to share our findings with you before we finalize our report." I sat across from her desk, my hands clenched in my lap, preparing for the worst possible news. "First, let me be clear that we found no evidence whatsoever to support the allegations made by your brother. Your actions during the convoy ambush were not only appropriate but exemplary. You saved lives that day, both military and civilian." The relief that washed over me was so intense I felt dizzy. "Thank you, Colonel. But I have to ask, where did Ryan get the idea that there was something wrong with my record? He seemed so certain, so convinced that he had proof." Colonel Martinez opened a folder on her desk and pulled out several documents. "That's where this gets interesting. We traced the source of your brother's information, and it appears he was contacted by someone claiming to be a former soldier who served with you in Iraq. This person provided him with what appeared to be official documents, suggesting you had covered up civilian casualties during the Ramadi incident." She slid the documents across the desk for me to examine. They looked official at first glance, with authentic-looking letterhead and formatting, but I could see immediately that they were forgeries. "The documents are sophisticated fakes," Colonel Martinez continued. "Whoever created them had access to military formatting and terminology, but there are subtle errors that revealed them as fraudulent. More importantly, we identified the person who contacted your brother. It's someone with a significant grudge against you." My heart sank as I realized what was coming next. "Who was it?" "Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Rodriguez had been in my unit during the Iraq deployment, but he wasn't the Rodriguez who died in the IED blast. This was a different soldier, someone who'd been court-martialed for desertion after abandoning his post during a firefight. I'd been one of the officers who'd testified against him, helping to ensure his conviction and dismissal from the Army. Rodriguez was released from military prison 18 months ago, Colonel Martinez explained. It appears he's been planning this revenge ever since. He researched your family, identified your brother as a potential weak point, and fed him false information designed to destroy your career and reputation. The pieces were falling into place now. Ryan's resentment and jealousy had made him the perfect target for manipulation. Rodriguez had found someone who already harbored doubts about my character, and simply gave him what appeared to be official validation for those doubts. What happens now? I asked. Rodriguez will be charged with fraud and possibly harassment. As for you, your record is completely cleared, and there will be a formal apology entered into your personnel file. You'll be reinstated to full duty immediately. I should have felt vindicated, but instead I felt empty. My name was cleared and my career was safe, but the damage to my family was irreparable. Ryan had been manipulated, but he'd also chosen to believe the worst about me, rather than trusting the brother who'd never given him reason to doubt my integrity. The formal vindication came at a ceremony that was deliberately low-key, attended only by military personnel and immediate family. General Thompson read a statement clearing me of all allegations and commending my service record. Mom and Emma were there, beaming with pride and relief, but Ryan's absence felt like a void that no amount of official recognition could fill. After the ceremony, General Thompson pulled me aside for a private conversation. Marcus, your record is clean and your career is back on track, but I need to ask you something. Are you planning to press charges against your brother for his role in this situation? I'd been dreading this question, knowing it would eventually come. Sir, my brother was a victim as much as anyone else. He was manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to exploit his vulnerabilities. I don't want to see him prosecuted for being fooled by a sophisticated fraud. General Thompson nodded approvingly. I think that shows remarkable character, Marcus. But you should know that regardless of your decision about your brother, Rodriguez will face the full consequences of his actions. What he did was a serious crime that could have destroyed an innocent officer's career. That evening, I sat in Mom's kitchen with her and Emma, trying to process everything that had happened over the past 6 weeks. The investigation was over, my reputation was restored, and my career was safe, but the family I'd grown up in was broken beyond repair. Have you talked to Ryan at all during the investigation? I asked Emma. She shook her head sadly. He's been completely shut down since the ceremony. Katie says he's barely speaking to anyone, just going through the motions at work and at home. I think the reality of what he did is starting to hit him, but he's too proud to admit he was wrong. He wasn't entirely wrong, I said quietly. I mean, he was wrong about the specific allegations, but he was right that I'd caused problems for our family. My choices did create distance between us. My success did make him feel diminished. Those feelings were real, even if the way he expressed them was destructive. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Marcus, honey, you can't blame yourself for following your calling, or for succeeding at what you chose to do. Ryan's insecurities and resentments were his responsibility to manage, not yours to accommodate. I knew she was right intellectually, but emotionally I couldn't shake the feeling that I could have done something different, something that would have prevented this whole catastrophe. Maybe if I'd been more sensitive to Ryan's feelings, maybe if I'd downplayed my achievements, maybe if I'd found ways to build him up instead of inadvertently overshadowing him. 2 weeks after my reinstatement, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I requested a transfer to Fort Campbell in Kentucky, accepting a position that was technically a lateral move but would take me away from Ohio and all the complicated family dynamics that had nearly destroyed my career. Why are you running away? Emma asked when I told her about the transfer. You've been vindicated. Everyone knows you were innocent. Why leave now when you could rebuild your reputation here? Because staying here means living with the constant reminder of what happened, I replied. Every time I walk into the VFW hall, Every time I run into someone who was at that ceremony, I'll be reminded of the day my own brother tried to destroy me in front of the entire community. I need a fresh start somewhere else." Emma was crying now, and I realized that my decision to leave was causing her the same kind of pain that my original decision to join the army had caused Ryan. "I'm losing both my brothers," she said through her tears. "Ryan won't talk to me because I supported you during the investigation, and now you're leaving because you can't face living in the same town as him. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to maintain relationships with both of you when you can't even be in the same state?" Her words cut deep because they forced me to confront the broader consequences of my choices. In trying to protect myself from further pain, I was inflicting pain on the one person in my family who'd never wavered in her support and love. I'm not abandoning you. I'll still be your brother no matter where I'm stationed. But I can't stay here and pretend that everything is normal when it's not. What about Mom? What about the family business? What about all the history we have here? The family business is Ryan's. It always has been. Mom will be fine. She's stronger than any of us realized. And the history, well, maybe it's time to stop living in the past and start building something new. The transfer was approved for August 2017, giving me 3 months to wrap up my responsibilities in Ohio and prepare for the move to Kentucky. During those months, I found myself thinking often about Dad and what he would have made of the situation. He'd always believed that family was the most important thing, that blood ties should transcend any other consideration. But he'd also believed in integrity and truth, values that Ryan had abandoned when he chose to believe lies about me, rather than trusting the evidence of 20 years of honorable service. I tried one last time to reach out to Ryan before leaving Ohio. I called the hardware store and asked to speak with him, hoping that the passage of time might have given him perspective on what had really happened. "Ryan, it's Marcus. I'm leaving for Kentucky next week, and I wanted to talk to you before I go." There was a long silence before he responded. "What do you want me to say, Marcus? Congratulations on beating the rap? Sorry for believing what someone told me about your service record. I want you to understand that you were manipulated by someone who had a grudge against me. The documents you saw were sophisticated forgeries, created by a disgraced soldier who wanted revenge. You weren't stupid or malicious. You were the victim of a well-planned deception." "Maybe," Ryan said quietly, "but that doesn't change the fact that I wanted to believe it. When that man showed me those papers, part of me was relieved to finally have evidence that you weren't as perfect as everyone thought. That's the part one can't forgive myself for, and it's the part you probably can't forgive either." His honesty was painful but also surprising. For the first time since the ceremony, Ryan was acknowledging his own role in what had happened, rather than simply deflecting blame. "I can forgive it," I said. "Ryan, you're my brother. I love you despite everything that's happened, but I can't forget it, and I can't pretend that it didn't fundamentally change our relationship." "I know," he replied. "I destroyed something that can't be rebuilt, and I have to live with that. But Marcus, for what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for being fooled by fake documents, but for 20 years of resenting your success instead of celebrating it. You deserved better from your family, especially from me." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement and the beginning of accountability. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope that maybe, someday, we might find a way to be brothers again. My final week in Ohio was bittersweet. I spent time with Mom, helping her with projects around the house and sharing memories of Dad. I had dinner with Emma and Derek, who announced their engagement and asked if I would perform the ceremony when I returned for their wedding the following year. I visited Dad's grave and left my original set of lieutenant's bars on his headstone, a symbol of the journey that had started with his encouragement and guidance. On my last day, I drove through downtown Cedar Falls one final time, past the hardware store where Ryan was probably working behind the counter, past the VFW hall where my promotion ceremony had turned into a nightmare, past all the familiar landmarks of a childhood that seemed both distant and immediate. This town had shaped me, given me values and strength and a foundation for everything I'd accomplished. But it had also been the site of my greatest humiliation and deepest family wounds. Fort Campbell brought new challenges and new opportunities. My role as brigade commander required skills I'd been developing for 20 years, and I threw myself into the work with renewed dedication. The soldiers under my command didn't know about the controversy in Ohio, didn't see me as anything other than a competent officer who'd earned his rank through merit and experience. But even as I built new professional relationships and tackled new responsibilities, I couldn't escape the reality that something fundamental had changed in me. The naive belief that family loyalty was unconditional had been shattered. The assumption that military service was universally respected and honored had been challenged. The confidence that comes from knowing your place in the world had been undermined by the discovery that the people closest to you might be the ones most capable of causing you harm. 6 months into my assignment at Fort Campbell, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Cedar Falls Gazette announcing that Davis Family Hardware had been sold to a regional chain. According to the article, Ryan Davis was retiring from retail to pursue other interests, and the iconic local business that had served the community for 3 generations would be transitioning to new ownership. The news hit me harder than I'd expected. Despite everything that had happened between Ryan and me, the hardware store had always represented family continuity, a tangible connection to Dad and Grandpa William, and all the history we shared. Its sale felt like the final dissolution of the Davis family legacy, the end of an era that had defined our identity for 70 years. I called Emma immediately to ask about the sale. She confirmed that Ryan had indeed sold the business, using the proceeds to pay off debts and start over with a clean slate. He couldn't handle working there anymore, she explained. Too many memories. Too many reminders of Dad and all the family expectations he felt he'd failed to meet. He's talking about moving to Florida, starting fresh somewhere nobody knows about the hardware store or the family history or any of it. What about Mom? How is she handling all these changes? She's actually doing better than any of us expected. She's been volunteering at the Historical Society, organizing Dad's papers and photographs for a community archive. She says it's therapeutic to focus on preserving positive memories instead of dwelling on recent problems. As 2018 progressed, I settled into my new life in Kentucky while maintaining long-distance relationships with Mom and Emma. Ryan and I didn't communicate directly, but I heard updates through Emma about his plans to relocate and his efforts to rebuild his life away from the shadows of family expectations and disappointments. The breakthrough came unexpectedly in November, when I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number with an Ohio area code. Marcus, this is Tom Mitchell. I served with your dad in Vietnam. We met at your promotion ceremony. I remembered Tom, one of Dad's closest friends, and a man whose opinion carried significant weight in the veteran community. Tom, it's good to hear from you. How can I help you? Well, son, I'm calling because the VFW is planning a memorial service for your dad on what would have been his 75th birthday. We want to honor his service and his contributions to the community, and we'd like you to be part of the ceremony. I know things got complicated at your promotion, but that doesn't change the fact that you're Bob Davis's son and a decorated veteran in your own right. The invitation caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to decline, to avoid returning to the site of my public humiliation and the ongoing family drama. But another part of me recognized this as an opportunity to honor Dad's memory, while maybe beginning to heal some of the wounds that had divided our family. Tom, I'd be honored to participate in Dad's memorial service. When is it scheduled? February 15th, which would have been his birthday. We're planning it for the VFW Hall, and we're hoping to get the whole family involved. Emma's already agreed to help with the planning, and we've reached out to Ryan as well. The mention of Ryan's potential involvement changed everything. This could be the opportunity for reconciliation that I'd been hoping for, a chance to come together in Dad's honor, rather than remaining divided by our own pride and resentment. Has Ryan agreed to participate? He's thinking about it. I get the sense he wants to honor his father, but he's struggling with facing the community after what happened at your promotion ceremony. Maybe if he knew you were supportive of his involvement, it might make the decision easier for him. I didn't hesitate. Tom, please tell Ryan that I hope he'll be part of the memorial service. Dad would want all his children there, and I think it's time for this family to start healing. The memorial service planning brought me back to Ohio several times over the following months, giving me opportunities to reconnect with the community and begin rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by the promotion ceremony controversy. People were gracious and welcoming, seeming to understand that I'd been the victim of a sophisticated deception rather than the perpetrator of any wrongdoing. More importantly, the planning process gave Ryan and me structured opportunities to work together on something we both cared about deeply. Our conversations were initially formal and careful, focused strictly on logistics and ceremony details. But gradually, as we collaborated on displays of Dad's memorabilia and coordinated with speakers who would share memories, the natural rhythm of brotherhood began to reassert itself. The memorial service itself was everything Dad would have wanted. The VFW hall was packed with family, friends, veterans, customers, and community members who'd been touched by his life. Ryan spoke about Dad's business legacy and his role as a community leader. I spoke about his military service and the values he'd instilled in his children. Emma coordinated a photo presentation that captured 7 decades of a life well lived. But the most meaningful moment came at the end of the ceremony when Ryan approached me as people were beginning to leave. "Marcus, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth about why I was so willing to believe those lies about your service record." I waited for him to continue, sensing that this was the conversation we'd needed to have for 20 years. "I was jealous," he said simply. "Not just of your military success, but of the person you became through your service. You grew into someone confident and principled and respected, while I felt like I was still the same insecure kid who stayed home because he was too scared to try anything else. When that man showed me those documents, part of me wanted them to be true, because it would mean you weren't actually better than me, just luckier." The honesty was painful, but also liberating. For the first time, Ryan was acknowledging the real source of our conflict, rather than hiding behind circumstantial grievances. "Ryan, you became someone remarkable too. You built something lasting, you served your community, you carried on traditions that mattered to Dad. We just chose different paths to different kinds of success." "Maybe," he said. "But it took almost destroying our family for me to understand that different doesn't mean competitive. I spent so much time measuring myself against your achievements that I forgot to appreciate my own." We stood together in the VFW hall where our relationship had nearly been destroyed, but this time the space felt healing rather than hostile. Around us, people were sharing stories about Dad and celebrating a life that had touched many others. It felt like the right place for 2 brothers to finally start rebuilding what they'd almost lost. "So where do we go from here?" I asked. "I don't know," Ryan admitted. "I can't undo what I did to you, and you can't undo 20 years of my resentment. But maybe we can start over, try to be the brothers Dad always hoped we could be." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. As I drove back to Kentucky that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope that the Davis family might survive the wounds we'd inflicted on each other. Dad's memorial service had reminded us that some things are bigger than our personal grievances, that family legacy is built not through perfect harmony, but through the willingness to forgive, rebuild, and try again. The epilogue to our story came 6 months later, when Emma and Derek were married in a ceremony that brought the scattered pieces of our family back together one more time. Ryan served as an usher. I performed the ceremony as Emma had requested, and Mom glowed with the pride of a woman who'd watched her children find their way back to each other despite everything that had tried to tear them apart. At the reception, Ryan and I found ourselves standing together at the bar, watching Emma dance with her new husband, while Mom chatted with old friends who'd come to celebrate with the Davis family. "You know," Ryan said, "Dad always said that some things you have to protect no matter the cost." I think he was talking about family, about the bonds that connect us even when we're too stubborn or proud to appreciate them. I nodded, thinking about all the battles we'd fought, all the wounds we'd inflicted, all the years we'd wasted in competition instead of collaboration. "Maybe that's the real lesson," I replied. "Not that family is easy or automatic, but that it's worth fighting for, even when the fight is against our own worst impulses." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, the 3 Davis siblings stood together for a family photo that would join the others in Mom's collection. We looked older than we had in the last family portrait with Dad, marked by experiences that had tested us all. But we were still there, still connected, still choosing each other despite everything that had tried to drive us apart. Looking at that photo now, I'm reminded that families aren't defined by their perfect moments, but by their willingness to survive their imperfect ones. Ryan and I will never completely undo the damage we inflicted on each other, but we've learned that love isn't about avoiding wounds. It's about choosing to heal together when the wounds inevitably come. The Colonel's Eagles I wear today carry the weight of lessons learned not just on battlefields overseas, but in the more personal combat zones of family loyalty, sibling rivalry, and the hard work of forgiveness. They remind me that true strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up and helping others do the same, especially when those others share your blood and your history and your hope for something better than what came before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.